I'm Veronica Marshall at the Capitol. This week on Senate Spotlight, we have the results from this week's special election, what it means for the Senate, and where it leaves this session's spirit of bipartisanship. And
looking into the new year, our concerns about the future of home ownership in Minnesota continue to grow.
Experts testify that the state's housing market is chronically undersupplied. We talk to senators about what caused the problem and what can be done to fix it. Plus,
we can no longer just let it be. We have to get involved and find ways to make sure that we're supporting childcare from family to center to nonprofits, all the above.
There's a new idea on how to keep in-home childcare providers in business, and it's getting support from both sides of the aisle. We have the details all coming up.
Senate Spotlight is produced by the Minnesota Senate and Senate Media Services.
The Senate's final seat has been filled, breaking the historic 33-33 tie. Voters in Senate District 60 elected Doran Clark to represent them. Clark previously served as chair for Senate District 60's DFL Central Committee and says the late Senator Carrie Dietzig's phrase, "Listen to the people and get to work," serves as his inspiration. Now, once the special elections results are certified, with 34 votes, the DFL will have the majority. That means Senator Bobby Joe Champion will assume the role of Senate President. DFL senators will continue to chair their committees, while the Republican senators who served as co-chair under the power-sharing agreement will now be the committee's leads. Despite the tie-breaking special election, the slim majority in the Senate means bipartisanship will remain a focus for the rest of the session. And there's one caucus in particular who is poised to seize the moment. This time, I'm not talking about the DFL or the Republicans. I'm talking about the Civility Caucus.
If it's a good idea, if it's common sense, let's do it. Doesn't care if it's Republican or Democrat.
That mentality led Republican Senator Zach Duckworth to the Civility Caucus.
I wasn't quite sure what to expect, other than I knew I was going to be going into a room full of people that were interested in working together to just get stuff done.
It's really understanding people as human beings, giving them the benefit of the doubt, giving them better communication tools.
Katie Pratt is the director of the state's Office of Collaboration and Dispute Resolution, which oversees the Civility Caucus. She says the caucus's time commitment is small, but for senators who come and Minnesota as a whole, the benefits are huge.
They're really busy, but they still need to eat. So we'll have some luncheons every session. Sometimes we'll bring in a speaker that would be of interest to their work. There was an opening event. We just had them all go around and introduce themselves and share a fun fact about them. And it was so cool to see there were different connections that people were identifying. Oh, I had no idea you came from there. I came from there too, and we both like this sort of thing. So they take those relationships and they bring them into their committee hearings, and they bring them into when they're trying to figure out a bill. And so knowing each other better as people and having that understanding is really a foundation for making better policy together.
Building the foundation of a solid relationship across the aisle really does help you be and appear more effective, and you get more work done.
But senators have to want to join the caucus, and that buy-in is especially important now.
Some legislators in Minnesota have only ever served in a trifecta circumstance, and so this might be some new learning, and they'll be looking for new tools and resources for how they get through this session.
The end of last session was not good. Speaking as somebody who's all about civility and working together and being very friendly with folks across the aisle, I think it's going to be tougher to start out session. Some rebuilding of relationships has to happen.
As co-chair of the Civility Caucus, Senator Duckworth is in position to help make that happen, along with his DFL co-chair, Senator Grant Hochschild.
It's really about making the connections that are beyond politics, but about the personal relationships that we as legislators should have in order to perhaps move into policy making in the future. So it's not about finding bipartisan policy agreements, but it is about laying the groundwork for those opportunities should they come up in the future.
Civility, empathy, and a little bravery.
In the polarized climate we live in right now, constituents may want you to be a fighter. I think it's a balance. I think it takes a certain amount of courage for anyone to engage in civil discourse, but probably especially legislators.
The Civility Caucus isn't only for the Senate. The House has representation and membership there as well.
roughly 70 to 80% of new housing in Minnesota is negotiated by planned unit development. And every time that PUDs are involved, the housing gets more expensive. Once again, this is unique to Minnesota. Yesterday's housing policies do not meet today's housing needs.
Experts testified before senators this week to talk about the challenges the state faces when it comes to housing. In addition to simply producing more units, Minnesota Housing says new housing projects need to address affordability. How do we do that? Senator Eric Lucero has several ideas and bills out already to address the issue. Senator, thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation to join you and discuss this very important topic.
Absolutely, yeah. We know this is a topic that touches everyone. And this is your third year now serving on this committee. What is it about it that's so important to you?
Well, my background is I'm a real estate agent, a licensed general contractor, and my wife and I obviously do real estate. She's also a real estate agent and a broker. So her and I team up and do a lot and are involved heavily with housing.
Now, Senator, what do you think is the greatest obstacle when it comes to homeownership here in Minnesota? And, what can people in the legislature do to help with that?
Well, the cost of home ownership and housing has risen dramatically in the last couple of years. It's been going up year over year for a while, but it has just exponentially risen. And when you look at whether you're a renter or whether a homeowner, the cost of maintenance, the cost of acquisition, the cost of building, all across the board continues to rise. And this is obviously in addition to costs in other areas of life that are rising and creating incredible pressure on housing stability.
All right, so we know over 500,000 Minnesota households are cost burdened. That means they're spending 30% or more of their income on housing. Why is that?
Well, whether you're a homeowner or whether a person is a renter, part of the aspects that go into the cost of renting or owning include the interest rate of any mortgage that might exist, the cost of insurance, and the cost of property taxes. So those costs are across the board are there. And even if you're a renter, the cost of insurance, the cost of property taxes, the cost of an interest rate charge are going to be passed along in the form of rent. And so as interest rates rise, as the cost of insurance rises, as property tax rise, all of that is being passed along, and it is putting higher rents and higher pressures on people to be able to afford their rent. It's putting higher pressures on people being able to afford their mortgages, and then it's putting pressures on people as they try to become homeowners, whether they come up with that down payment to get a loan or whether they come up with the money month over month for the mortgage payment.
So we know these costs are rising. What can we do about that to make housing more affordable here in Minnesota?
Well, it's a simple answer, but a more challenging solution. So the answer to that is supply, is the age-old law of supply and demand. As supply becomes less, if the demand becomes increases and supply becomes less, then the prices go up. And in this case, that's exactly what's been happening, is demand has risen dramatically, supply in whether it be new construction, and there's a myriad of reasons why people are not selling their houses, whether they are in a starter home and they're waiting to purchase a move-up home, or whether somebody's in their second home or third home and maybe they're empty nesters, and there's reasons why people are not downsizing and freeing up the ability for the next stage of people to move into the housing there. But the challenges here of the supply is the greatest thing that we need to tackle and what we're trying to do in our conversations in the legislature.
Now, is there a way we can do that without incurring great costs to the state? Because as you know, this is a budget year, but there is a big deficit on the horizon. So are there solutions to this housing problem in Minnesota that don't come with a price tag?
Well, when you look at property taxes, that is something that legislators can and should be taking a deeper dive at. Is there something that can be done to bring relief so that property taxes are not rising so dramatically? When it comes to insurance, where there's been a number of variables, whether they be hailstorms or other types of damage, that insurance companies then are bearing the cost, and that cost is being passed on, obviously, in monthly insurance rates. And so as a state, is there anything we can do to perhaps look at mandates or other types of reforms that allow for insurance companies to streamline, become more efficient, and therefore obviously reduce their risk and reduce the amount of cost that's passed on to homeowners or renters in the form of rent. And then when it comes to interest rates are something that's a much larger conversation and really can't be dealt with at a state level. But nevertheless, they are a huge factor in the cost of money. And so that would be for existing homes. Then you add in another variable, which would be new construction. Are there areas and opportunities at a state level that we can help to reduce the cost of new construction? One such example I have is a bill that I've introduced that would exempt the sales tax on building materials. Now, if let's just say in a scenario there's $100,000 of building materials that go into the construction of a new house, the sales tax, let's just say 7.5%, that's $7,500 just on that alone. If it's $200,000 going into a house, then we're looking at $15,000. That's a significant chunk of change. So if we could exempt the sales tax, for example, that would help reduce the cost of construction and help reduce the cost, obviously, of the final cost of that home.
Senator, you mentioned a lot of new construction that is needed, and we know a lot of these new construction homes come with homeowners associations. You've been hearing testimony from people across the state on homeowners associations. What have your big takeaways from those meetings been?
Yeah, so there's a work group that I have been the privilege of being a participant on, a member of, that's been meeting for approximately the last 6 months. And it's a bipartisan group. It's had stakeholders representing various interests that have a relationship, obviously, with CICs, which is Common Interest Community, and HOAs, Homeowners Associations, and looking at what are the ways this current system is broken. What are the ways that it can and needs to be reformed to bring transparency, to bring accountability? And these voices that we've heard in forms of testimony, public testimony, experts in different areas, have all contributed to the absolute need to bring reforms. And so this work group has recently published their recommendations, and myself and a bipartisan group of legislators are going to be taking those recommendations, creating one or several bills that we look to advance bipartisanly in the legislature this session to, again, bring that transparency, accountability, streamline, and make things reducing costs for homeowners.
So you've mentioned the bill about HOA reform. You mentioned one about construction. What other bills do you have floating out there on this housing topic?
Well, I'm open to many different areas. Perhaps that I don't even have bills that I've authored or co-authored, but among them would be, I'm open to conversation on anything that impacts the cost of current homeownership, current rent, or new construction, any topic. One such topic could be the cost of permits. And I'm definitely interested in taking a look at that to see, are there areas that we could reduce the cost of the permits that go into new construction. Anything that contributes to the cost, whether it be the materials, whether it be the permits, whether it be the labor that goes into it, all of those costs, they contribute to the final price that a house is sold at. And so if we can reduce any one of those individual components that lead to the total cost, that's going to reduce the overall cost, obviously. But again, it's also going to hopefully spur or be a catalyst to more supply through new construction.
Yeah, everything helps. Senator, any final thoughts that you'd like to share on this topic?
Well, I am very excited on this topic because home ownership impacts everybody, whether you're a renter or an owner, whether you're young or older, more seasoned, whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, or something else. And all of us are looking for stability and to reduce the cost so we can enjoy the American dream of homeownership, so we can start building generational wealth. And that is something that I'm super excited about and think has a lot of momentum here this year.
Senator, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Housing is unaffordable for half of all renters. That's according to the Minnesota Housing Partnership's latest report. Renters are also more cost burdened now than at any other point in the last decade. Housing instability is on the rise as well, with evictions in Minnesota increasing by 44% compared to pre-COVID levels. Joining me now is Senator Lindsey, who says housing is a key priority for her this session. Senator, welcome to Senate Spotlight.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So this is not your first time on the Housing and Homelessness Prevention Committee. What is it about this topic that speaks to you?
Yeah, I think when I think about housing, I see it as the foundation for everything else. If you don't have stable housing, everything else gets harder. We have lower economic possibilities, we have worse educational outcomes, we have worse health outcomes. So stable housing is really the key for every family in Minnesota. And I think that's the other piece about it. There's not a lot of policy that we work on in this state that literally affects every single person's life, but housing does. So it is across all communities, it is across all types of people. It really is just the cornerstone.
Yeah, and we know that housing is also not an issue unique to Minnesota, but what are some of the challenges that are unique to our state?
Yeah, in Minnesota, we have sort of a slightly different ecosystem than a lot of other states. We have a great combination of for-profit and nonprofit housing providers. We also have a housing finance agency that is really invested in our state and has been able to be sort of more creative than a lot of other states just because of the way that we built it and that we connected it to our legislature. A lot of states don't actually connect their housing finance agency to their legislature, so it allows us to be partners, which is great. But we also have areas of the state that really have huge opportunity for economic investment. Northern Minnesota, for instance, we have a lot of great companies up there, Polaris, DigiKey, but they can't provide housing to expand. So we are really a state that has the ability to grow, except we don't have housing.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit more about that. You know, we know there is a shortage of homes. Why?
You know, it's sort of a long, complicated history of housing in this whole country. The federal government really in the 60s and 70s, and especially the 80s, sharply cut investments in housing. And that was not something that the state could just make up the difference for. So we had to rely on nonprofits and for-profit businesses to come into the space and invest, which is just harder. And then over the last years since the pandemic, we've seen just so much instability in people's jobs, in people's health, and that all, again, trickles down to housing. Rents have continued to go up and up and up over the last 20 years, where wages have stayed relatively flat, which means housing just every year gets slightly more out of reach for Minnesotans.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question. You know, in 2023, you authored a bill providing a historic $1 billion investment in Minnesota housing. But in a recent meeting, Minnesota Housing said there is still a need even now. Can you talk to me about the difference in those needs, the needs we saw before and the needs we're seeing now?
Absolutely. We spent a good chunk of the money during the pandemic keeping people housed. We had federal funds that came in to help us with that. But just keeping people in their homes during the pandemic was the critical need. There wasn't the ability for people to really move a lot, and we just needed to keep them stable. Since that time, we really have seen the need for more units. It's been slowly building over the last 4 decades, and now has reached a point where we're over 100,000 units short, which is a huge number. So when we invested $1 billion, it was an incredible step. One of my proudest moments in this legislature was seeing us actually make that big investment. But the reality is, in a normal year, housing is 0.03% of the state budget, which is just nowhere near what we actually need. When you think of the fact that it really affects every single person in Minnesota, to have it be such a small percentage of our budget means that it's going to take years and years and years for us to catch up. The other thing about investments in housing, particularly in production, is they don't happen overnight. You know, we invested almost half of that money into production of new units, but that's going to take several years for us to actually see that investment come to fruition, because it just takes time to build houses.
Yeah. So you mentioned the budget and what a small part housing gets. This is a budget year, but there is a deficit looming on the horizon.
Yeah.
So what do you think we can do with housing in that budget space?
I think there are a couple of things. First, we can look at policy that can remove some of the barriers that are in place for us actually building more units. But secondly, even with a challenging budget sort of space, I would say that what we heard in MMB's budget forecast overview was part of the reason that revenues are down in Minnesota is because people are spending too much of their income on housing and healthcare. So I think if we look at deciding not to make investments in housing in this challenging period, we're only exacerbating the problem. We can make, even modest investments to continue to keep people stably housed during this time.
Last session, you put forth ideas, bipartisan housing policies that ultimately failed, with critics saying one size fits all doesn't work in Minnesota.
Yep.
And I know work was done during the interim to look at those challenges and address them. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. We spent a lot of time in this interim. Myself and Chair Howard over in the House worked with all of the stakeholders, not just the folks who were bringing ideas to us for zoning reform, but with the folks who had concerns too. Cities and counties across the state. We spent many hours in meetings discussing the different proposals and how we can sort of streamline things to be a little bit more strategic, and I would say go in with a scalpel instead of a bulldozer, and see if we can find ways that really do reduce costs. And I think being able to look at it in that way, what are the barriers to getting starter homes built? I think that's one of our key questions. We haven't seen starter homes built in Minnesota in years. And young people and seniors who are looking to downsize need that kind of housing. So we're really sort of focusing in, and it has been bipartisan every step of the way. I think as we get these bills finished up and introduce them, you'll see an incredible coalition of organizations and also legislators that we might not work on anything else together ever through our legislative career, but this is a space that we found common ground.
Well, that's great that you have that bipartisan support. What do you think it will help you accomplish on this topic this session?
I think it's really going to change the narrative. I think we've been able to sort of circle in on what the real barriers are and how we can address them. And I think because we have such a broad, interesting coalition, that it's going to collect some notice. And I think that we've done the work now to really show the cities that we are working in good faith, and they have spent time at the table with us. So I think we'll be able to move through this process, not necessarily agreeing on every step, but being able to work together.
What are some of those challenges you're anticipating?
I think cities, as we do as the legislature, we don't like it when the governor tells us what to do. Cities don't like it when the state tells them what to do, and we understand that. I think one of the big changes is we've been able to focus this conversation on the needs of the communities. And we've been able to really bring cities in, bring in mayors and city councilors to talk about the actual things that stop housing from being built. And I think it's really opened the door for both sides to have new conversations about how we can actually make those changes.
Senator, is there anything else you'd like to say on this issue?
I think just a reminder that housing is the foundation for all of us. And when we can focus the conversation around those human needs of housing, it's something that everybody understands. And I think it can be a place where in what might be a challenging legislative session, we can find real common ground.
Senator, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
The call is out for an early bonding bill to help fund infrastructure projects across the state. Because the Senate didn't pass a bonding bill last session, Senator Judy Seeberger says people in Hastings are now on the hook for a water treatment plant that meets the new PFAS contamination requirements. Seeberger dropped a cash and a bonding bill calling for $16.6 million to help start Hastings' $70 million water treatment project. She says while her bills target Hastings' needs, an early bonding bill would serve several other communities.
If you look at all the bills that were dropped in the Senate and had their first reading on Thursday, it's just page after page after page of bonding requests and infrastructure proposals.
The Senate's DFL Blue Dog Coalition also released a statement of support, saying an early standalone bonding bill is a top priority. Some Senate Republicans have also expressed support for bonding bills related to infrastructure. In a statement, Republican Senator Karen Housley says, quote, "I'm looking forward to crafting a bonding proposal that prioritizes safe transportation, clean water, and investing in critical regional projects. There's room to bond for important bipartisan projects." When it comes to childcare, the demand is high and the supply is low. Now, a new bill hopes to balance those scales. Republican Senator Bill Weber introduced Senate File 339, which allows in-home child care providers to receive a credit of 50% of the net tax owed on their residential property after subtracting other credits. He says the goal is to support and help sustain Minnesota's current in-home child care providers, which in turn supports the community as a whole.
I hope that at least in this small way, we can provide some assistance and some incentive to keep as many people into the business as possible.
My understanding is close to 60% of the in-home care providers in central Minnesota have gone out of business in the last 5 years. So it's a profound crisis.
After hearing the proposal, DFL Senators Eric Putnam and Grant Hochschild offered to sign on to the bill as well. If passed, the bill would impact property taxes payable in 2026. Educators came to the Capitol to air their concerns. The issues ranged from summer unemployment insurance to school suspension laws to funding and where to set their priorities.
We're honored to shoulder the issues of mental health and food inadequacy in our community, but you don't grade us on food and mental health. You grade us on academic performance and graduation rates. And I want to make a statement to the whole committee as a policy. If your policy is we're going to put all the burdens of the community on the backs of public education, grade us for it.
Every district up here talked about deficits and cuts that have either already happened or will be happening in the future. If that does not sound alarm bells, I don't know what does.
The Education Policy Committee also heard a bill from DFL Senator Erin May Quaid. The bill, known as Senate File 334, allows school districts to reduce teachers' instructional time in the classroom this school year by 5.5 hours to allow time for READ Act-related professional development. The READ Act, which was passed in 2023, was a $100 million investment in student literacy. The READ Act 2.0 passed last year and provided an additional $31 million to pay educators for completing READ Act training. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.